There's an image that keeps returning to me whenever I speak with men who feel profoundly alone. A man standing in the middle of a crowded city at dusk, lights moving around him, people rushing past, conversations drifting like smoke. And yet he feels like a ghost at the feast, present but untouched, visible but unseen, surrounded by motion yet living at a different frequency entirely. What he rarely admits, even to himself, is the fear beneath that stillness, the quiet suspicion that something about him is fundamentally off, that everyone else seems fluent in a language he never learned. In the first 90 seconds, let me name one of the most common illusions men carry here, the one that corrodes from the inside, the belief that, if I were normal, friendship would be natural. It's a sentence that sounds rational, but it hides a brutal misinterpretation. The assumption that difficulty connecting means personal deficiency. Most men don't notice how quickly this assumption becomes identity. If I don't have close friends by now, maybe I'm just built wrong. The tragedy isn't the loneliness. It's the quiet verdict they pass on themselves without ever investigating the evidence. Part of what intensifies this shame is the culture around us. We're told that real men have a brotherhood, a squad, a network, that adulthood is supposed to come with a tribe who instinctively understands us. Yet when you scan your own life, maybe you see gaps instead of bonds, silence where others seem to have support, and a version of yourself who tries not to need anything because needing feels dangerous. This is the moment where many men collapse inward, assuming their solitude must reflect a flaw in character or masculinity. But that conclusion is a learned story, not a truth. Jung once suggested that loneliness doesn't come from the absence of people. It comes from the inability to share what feels essential. In other words, it's not the crowd around you that determines your sense of belonging. It's whether you feel met in the places where you are most yourself. This lens changes everything. It shifts the question from, why can't I connect, to, where in my life have I never been met deeply enough to trust the world with who I am? What looks like a lack of friends is often misattunement, not deficiency, a mismatch between your depth and the environments you've been in. Modern research adds a different layer. We now know that prolonged isolation increases rates of depression, anxiety, and even premature mortality. Not because lonely men are weak, but because the nervous system literally depends on meaningful connection to regulate itself. When that connection is missing, the body interprets the world as unsafe. The result isn't apathy, it's vigilance, withdrawal, hyperanalysis, numbness in some places, overwhelm in others. These aren't personality flaws. They're adaptations to a life that hasn't offered consistent emotional resonance. And yet there's something else happening beneath the surface of men who live with few or no friends. It's subtle, easily mistaken for dysfunction, and often completely misunderstood. Many of these men carry rare psychological traits, powerful inner worlds, sharp intuition, an almost allergic reaction to superficiality. They don't tolerate small talk because small talk feels like a betrayal of the truth they sense beneath things. They're not antisocial, they're precise. They're not broken, they're calibrated for depth. But when the world mirrors none of that precision back, calibration starts to feel like malfunction. This is where the core wound forms. If I'm this alone, something in me must be fundamentally flawed. That sentence, even if never spoken aloud, becomes the architecture of a man's inner life. It shapes his posture, his expectations, his silence, and the way he interprets every social moment. It turns neutral interactions into evidence against himself, and over years, it hardens into identity. But identity built on misinterpretation is simply a shadow wearing the mask of truth. If you want, you can consider this video a long, steady unraveling of that shadow. Not with quick fixes, not with social tricks, but with a deeper mapping of the psychological traits, the wounds, and the archetypal tensions at the heart of this experience. We're going to explore why men who feel friendless often carry forms of depth that were never recognized, how early relational wounds distort present relationships, and why some of your most painful patterns are actually signs of untapped strength. There is one moment coming later, around the midpoint, where you may feel something shift. It's a pattern lonely men rarely see in themselves, a pattern that quietly flips the entire "I'm broken" narrative. I'll point to it when we get there, but you'll likely feel it before I name it. For now, hold this gently. Loneliness is not proof of inadequacy. It is a a story, and sometimes an initiation. And if any part of what you've heard so far mirrors something you've lived, you're already closer to clarity than you think. There is a particular quiet that forms in men who move through the world feeling slightly out of phase with everyone around them. Not quieter in volume, quieter in frequency. It's the silence of someone who notices more than he's supposed to, someone whose mind doesn't skim the surface of conversations, but drops straight to the undercurrent. And for men like this, ordinary bonding often feels strangely hollow, as if everyone else is playing a game whose rules were never explained. What looks from the outside like aloofness is usually something far more tender, the sense that revealing one's real interior might overwhelm the room. This begins young. Many men who carry this depth were told early, directly or indirectly, that they were too intense, too thoughtful, too serious. They learned that their inner world, vivid, inquisitive, layered, made other people uncomfortable. Even loving caregivers can send this message when they are overwhelmed by the boy's emotional range, or unsure how to meet his sensitivity without dismissing it. Over time, this creates a private equation. Depth equals burden. And once that equation forms, it operates in every room a man enters, whether he notices it or not. Jung would call this the early stirring of individuation, the pull away from collective expectations toward an interior truth. But without real initiation or guidance, difference feels like malfunction. A young man doesn't think, "I'm individuating." He thinks, "Something about me makes others uneasy." What gets buried is not the depth itself, but the belief that it has a place in the world. The outer persona then adapts, smoothing edges, shrinking reactions, performing a simpler version of the self. The inner life remains vibrant but hidden, and the hiding slowly becomes habit. When a man like this enters social environments that rely on small talk, his body often reacts before his mind understands why. There's a physiological mismatch. Social neuroscience shows that meaningless interaction doesn't calm the nervous system. It amplifies the sense of being alone. Men wired for introspection come out of shallow gatherings, not energized but depleted, carrying a faint film of self-disgust they can't quite name. It isn't because they dislike people. It's because the conversation never touched the terrain where they actually live. A subtle shift happens here, one that complicates connection later. After enough experiences of being misunderstood or minimized, many men begin pre-rejecting others. Not consciously, more like an internal filtering process that silently whispers, "They won't get me," long before real contact occurs. It's a protective maneuver shaped by old wounds. Projection steps in, convincing the man that new people will repeat old patterns, misread him, judge him, dismiss him, and rather than risk that injury again, he withdraws before the moment of exposure ever arrives. This is where the outsider subtly becomes the cynic. What began as a defense becomes an identity. The man tells himself he prefers solitude because people are shallow. But beneath that explanation lives something more vulnerable. The fear that if anyone truly saw him, they would misunderstand what they found. The contempt is easier to hold than the fear. It feels stronger, but it also isolates him from the very kind of depth he craves. One of the most striking images for this psychological position is the masterless warrior, the Ronin. A man with a disciplined internal code but no clan to practice it with. He carries standards, integrity, and loyalty, but no shared framework where those qualities can circulate. In stories, the Ronin wanders not because he is flawed, but because he has not yet found a place where his inner truth can be enacted without distortion. Many men who feel friendless live this archetype without realizing it. They mistake apprenticeship for punishment. They confuse exile with verdict. And here is a reframing that may land a little harder as it settles. Sometimes what feels like social inadequacy is actually a form of depth that never had the right container. You are not malfunctioning. You may simply be calibrated for relationships that demand more honesty, more stillness, and more resonance than you've ever been offered. 2 topics from now, we'll place this outsider pattern beside a story, the kind told quietly by a man who spent most of his 20s friendless before realizing what had been driving everything underneath. For many men, that story becomes the hinge that shifts the whole arc. There is a particular kind of man whose solitude is not empty, but densely populated. His mind is a landscape of possibilities, imagined conversations, parallel futures, and intricate reflections. It is a place where he feels not only safe, but competent. A world where the rules make sense and the emotional terrain is familiar. For him, the inner life is not an escape from reality. It is a reality that feels more coherent than the outer one. And the people around him often have no idea how rich that world truly is. Many men who struggle to form friendships aren't cold or detached. They are living with a level of inner architecture that never had room to breathe in childhood. When imagination becomes the only place where a boy can express himself fully, it grows into a citadel, a sanctuary, a carefully protected interior in which humiliation cannot reach him and misunderstandings cannot distort him. In that space, he holds conversations that would collapse in a shallow room. He explores ideas that would fall flat in groups built on surface-level banter. Over time, his mind becomes a place where connection feels possible precisely because no one else is involved. But this sanctuary has an unintended consequence. When imagination replaces shared experience, something subtle is lost. Collision. The small, human unpredictabilities that shape real relationships. The interruptions, the differing opinions, the misread signals, the friction that refines intimacy. In the mind, nothing interrupts, nothing contradicts, nothing wounds. And so the man learns a dangerous half-truth. That connection should feel as smooth as the world he built internally. When reality inevitably disrupts that expectation, he retreats, convinced the outer world lacks the depth he requires, when in truth, it's the variability of relationships that scares him most. Neuroscience adds an important dimension here. The brain is wired to seek reward with the least risk possible. For a man with a vivid imagination, the inner world offers micro-rewards, small bursts of dopamine from planning, envisioning, analyzing, consuming content, constructing narratives. None of these are addictions in the dramatic sense. They're more like low-risk pleasures that ask nothing in return. They don't require vulnerability. They don't push back. They don't expose him to misunderstanding. Over the years, this creates a nervous system that subtly prefers mental simulation to real engagement. Not because he lacks social ability, but because the mind feels safer and more coherent than the unpredictable world of other people. This leads to a reframing many men resist at first. Difficulty socializing doesn't necessarily mean social inadequacy. More often, it reflects social unpracticedness. A man can spend thousands of hours rehearsing inside his mind and very few hours engaging in embodied interaction. His strategist archetype becomes overdeveloped, brilliant at anticipating outcomes, imagining consequences, rehearsing dialogues, while his friend or lover archetype remains underfed. He isn't failing socially. He is overtrained in the wrong arena. And this imbalance can create a sense of incompetence that feels personal, when in reality it is simply a matter of asymmetry. There is another layer that deepens the isolation. When a man lives so richly inside himself, he often develops an internal image of the ideal friend, someone part sage, part warrior, part therapist, part mirror. Someone who sees him completely, tracks his depth effortlessly, and never misunderstands his intentions. This image is not childish. It is a translation of unmet longings, but no actual human can match a composite figure shaped from years of private imagination. So real people fail him by default, not because they are unworthy, but because they are human. This is where loneliness begins to feel self-created, even though the man rarely recognizes it. He dismisses potential friendships not out of arrogance, but from a refined form of avoidance disguised as discernment. He protects his inner world by ensuring no one gets close enough to disrupt it. The cost is quiet, but cumulative. Conversations begin to feel stale. Groups feel foreign. People feel blunt where he feels layered. Yet the deeper truth is often simpler and more merciful. His inner life grew faster than his outer network ever had the chance to. What looks like emotional distance may actually be the growing pains of a man whose imagination matured in isolation, leaving his social world undeveloped by comparison. This tension sets the stage for the next chapter, where we explore why men with strong inner lives often become intolerant of anything that feels inauthentic, and why the wrong crowd feels more dangerous than solitude itself. There comes a point in the life of a solitary man when he stops trying to adapt himself to environments that cannot hold his depth. What others interpret as withdrawal is often something more instinctive, the nervous system remembering old wounds and refusing to repeat them. Men who have lived with few or no friends often carry a form of loyalty that was once betrayed, mocked, or mishandled. That early rupture becomes the invisible blueprint for every social situation that follows. For many, the story begins with friendships that were not truly friendships. Early companions who used them for their intelligence, or mocked their seriousness, or exposed their vulnerabilities for amusement. Sometimes it wasn't cruelty so much as carelessness, emotional negligence that left a lasting imprint. The young mind, still forming its sense of worth, interpreted this as a rule rather than an anomaly. The lesson became embedded not in language but in the body. Never need anyone enough to be hurt again. And because no one stepped in to defend that early sensitivity, the boy internalized the pain as a personal flaw rather than an environmental failure. Over time, the shadow develops. Intolerance for manipulation hardens into intolerance for humanity itself. A man who once longed for connection begins scanning others for signs of hypocrisy, superficiality, or disloyalty. Jung might call this the judge archetype, rising without the balancing presence of the king, a figure who can discern truth without condemning the world. Without that balance, the man sees through everything but builds nothing. He protects himself from disappointment by narrowing the field of potential relationships until only solitude feels safe. This shift rarely announces itself. It shows up subtly, in small exits. A man slips out of a group chat without saying much. He stops responding to invitations, telling himself he prefers the clarity of solitude. At first, this choice feels noble, as if he is preserving his integrity by avoiding environments that dull it. But months later, when the silence accumulates, something else begins to surface. The loneliness that follows is not the clean solitude he imagined. It is a thick, heavy absence, the realization that no one knows his inner world, and no one is coming to look for it. In this place, many men feel a quiet ache they rarely speak of. The ache of knowing they contributed to their own distance without understanding why. The ache of recognizing that what once protected them has become the very thing isolating them. It's an insight that can feel confronting, especially for men who pride themselves on clarity. Here is the sentence that often makes them pause. The nervous system that once saved you now distrusts even the people who might be safe. And beneath that sentence lies a deeper tension. Throughout history, figures who carried unusual insight, prophets in deserts, philosophers on mountains, hermits in forests, retreated not out of disdain for the world, but out of necessity. They needed space to refine perception, to metabolize truths that were not yet ready to be spoken. But in every story, they returned. Exile was a chapter, not the entire book. The danger for modern men is forgetting the return. Forgetting that solitude is meant to strengthen one's vision, not replace connection entirely. This is where the man who feels intolerant of inauthenticity often misreads his own design. What he interprets as a flaw is frequently evidence of a refined sensitivity, a desire for resonance, truth, and mutual recognition. He pulls away not because he hates people, but because he has tasted betrayal and refuses to revisit it. Yet without guidance, the line between discernment and exile becomes almost invisible. The next chapter will move deeper into this tension, how the belief, "I'm bad at social skills," is often a shield protecting a far more vulnerable truth, and how the nervous system, not the personality, becomes the gatekeeper of intimacy. There is a moment in many men's lives when they stop trying to understand their loneliness and instead label themselves with a quiet, heavy conclusion. "I'm bad at social skills." It sounds humble, but it carries a deeper resignation. It suggests the problem is ability rather than history, identity rather than experience. And once a man adopts that belief, he no longer studies his patterns with curiosity. He simply accepts exile as part of his nature. But beneath that self-assessment lies something far more human. For men who have been misunderstood, dismissed, or shamed for showing their real emotions, authenticity begins to feel dangerous. Not because they lack social intelligence, but because the moments when they revealed themselves were met with confusion, criticism, or indifference. The nervous system remembers those moments long after the mind forgets them. What appears on the surface as social difficulty is often a long habit of self-protection. Many men learned early that their anger was too sharp, their grief too heavy, their enthusiasm too intense. So they crafted versions of themselves that caused fewer ripples, versions that were easier for others to manage, versions that took up less emotional space. Over time, these edited identities become the default. A man learns to present as low maintenance, agreeable, quiet, adaptable. He believes this makes him easier to love, but it quietly disconnects him from the vitality he wishes others could see. The paradox is painful. The very self he hides is the one longing to be recognized. There is a body-level logic shaping this pattern. When closeness has historically led to volatility, criticism, or abandonment, the nervous system begins treating intimacy the way it treats physical danger. It contracts, it scans, it retreats. The man may think he is choosing solitude, but often it's his body choosing safety. And because it is subtle, a tightening in the chest, a drop in the stomach, a thought saying not worth it, he misreads it as personality rather than protection. This is one of the most misunderstood psychological dynamics in men's lives. Fear wearing the mask of introversion. This is where the belief, "I'm bad at social skills," does its quiet damage. It prevents the man from recognizing that most of what he perceives as inability is actually underexposure. He has spent so much time predicting rejection that he rarely gives life the chance to surprise him. His internal strategy becomes perfection. Only speak when certain. Only reveal when guaranteed safety. Only express emotion that cannot be misread. But real connection thrives on imperfection. No one can know the parts of a man that he rehearses endlessly, but never expresses. There is a gentle experiment some men consider when they begin noticing this pattern. Once a week, in a moment that feels low stakes, they reveal a single sentence of genuine thought or preference. Not a confession, not a performance, just a small exposure that lets their true interior make contact with the outside world. The point isn't to impress anyone, it's to remind the nervous system that authenticity does not always bring harm. These tiny moments create micro-adjustments inside a man. They loosen the old equation that says vulnerability equals danger. Another tension rises here, one that many men feel but rarely articulate. After canceling plans, there is often a wave of relief followed quickly by shame. Relief because the body avoids the unpredictability of connection. Shame because the man knows the avoidance is costing him something essential. This combination is not a sign of failure. It is the signature of a man whose inner leader has not yet been fully claimed. Some men thrive in chaos, others in quiet, but men with strong inner architecture often discover they are most capable when the stakes are real and the environment is grounded. The issue isn't deficiency, it's armor. A man may assume that his tendency to withdraw, overthink, or avoid is proof that he lacks the skill or charisma others seem to possess. But when viewed through a different lens, these traits can signal something else entirely: unrealized leadership. Men who avoid small talk often excel in crisis. Men who struggle with casual presence often have a deep sense of responsibility. Men who hesitate before speaking often carry insights that, once expressed, shift the atmosphere of a room. The question becomes not, "What's wrong with me?" but, "What part of me has been overprotected for too long?" This reframing prepares the ground for the next chapter, where we look directly at the archetypal energy hiding beneath isolation. The uncrowned king who is yet to find his realm, his circle, or the inner authority that allows him to lead himself before leading anyone else. When you're ready, we will move into that terrain. There is a form of loneliness that does not come from lack, but from excess. An excess of discernment, integrity, sensitivity, and inner standards that feel out of sync with the world around you. Men who experience prolonged isolation often assume this is a sign of inadequacy, but more often, it is the early whisper of an archetype that has not yet been claimed. The man who feels unseen is frequently the man whose internal standards are higher than anything he has ever encountered. He senses what loyalty should feel like, what truth should sound like, what integrity should require. These intuitions are not fantasies. They are early indicators of leadership. But without guidance or initiation, this leadership energy collapses inward. It becomes a private monarchy with no kingdom, a king without a court, a man with standards but no structure in which to apply them. Instead of nurturing clarity, the energy becomes self-critical. Instead of fostering direction, it dissolves into rumination. This creates a paradox. The very traits that would make a man trustworthy and grounded in a community become the traits that isolate him when he has no one to channel them with. Discernment mutates into hyper-judgment. Reflection becomes withdrawal. Integrity becomes perfectionism. The throne sits empty, but the weight of the crown is still felt. This is where many men silently misread themselves. They interpret their high expectations as evidence that they are impossible to satisfy or doomed to be alone. But these expectations often reflect something else, an internal blueprint for the kind of relationships their psyche is built for. Jung suggested that certain individuals perceive value structures earlier than those around them. Nietzsche echoed this in his writings about early seers, people whose vision matures before their circumstances do. When this happens, the man mistakes temporal misalignment for personal deficiency. He assumes he is behind when, in reality, he may simply be ahead of schedule. That misinterpretation can be devastating. It erodes confidence, blurs identity, and convinces the man that his longing for depth is unreasonable. Yet when viewed differently, the pattern reveals something important. His standards are not obstacles to connection. They are signposts guiding him toward the relationships where he will finally feel regulated, recognized, and met. The problem is not that he expects too much, but that he has never been in an environment where his expectations make sense. There is a biological dimension to this as well. Human beings are not wired for large networks. They are wired for a small number of stable, attuned relationships. When a man with strong focus and emotional precision tries to function without that core group, his cognition becomes distorted. He becomes hypervigilant, analytical, guarded. Not because he is flawed, but because the social circuitry of the brain depends on meaningful connection to operate cleanly. Men with potent inner lives are not meant to float from crowd to crowd. They are designed to become gravitational centers around which a small circle naturally forms. The challenge is that this gravitational pull cannot emerge when the man hides himself behind self-protection, avoidance, or perfectionism. A king cannot rule from exile. He must know the terrain of his own heart well enough to inhabit it without apology. But before he can lead others, he must learn to lead his own nervous system, to understand its signals, its fears, its illusions, and its strengths. This is not about dominance or hierarchy. It is about self-stewardship. A man who stewards himself well becomes someone others instinctively trust because his presence is steady rather than reactive. Yet perhaps the most striking part of this archetype appears when imagining the mentor he never had. Picture an older man who once walked the same lonely path, misunderstood, isolated, unsure whether his depth was a flaw or a calling. Over the years, that man learned to cultivate a small circle, built not on performance, but alignment. He learned that loyalty is not loud, that brotherhood is not borrowed, and that solitude is not the end of the story. He would tell the younger man something like this: "Your isolation is not a verdict. It is training, a preparation for the relationships, responsibilities, and clarity you are meant to carry once your inner architecture has matured." This reframing often lands with a quiet jolt. It shifts the narrative from "I am alone because something is wrong with me" to "I am alone because something in me is still forming." It doesn't erase the ache. It gives the ache direction. It transforms aimless solitude into an initiatory season, one that shapes the man into someone capable of receiving the depth he has always longed to give. The next chapter brings this journey toward its conclusion. It integrates everything that has been explored: the wounds, the depth, the patterns, the misinterpretations, and brings the arc back to its central truth, that men who feel broken by loneliness are often not broken at all, but simply early. There is a stillness that arrives near the end of a journey like this. Not the stillness of defeat, but the stillness of recognition. By now, the patterns may feel less like failures and more like clues. The isolation may feel less like a verdict and more like a map. And the parts of yourself you once treated as liabilities may begin to reveal their original purpose. What once appeared as brokenness starts to look like timing. Here are the truths that hold the arc together, gathered as quietly and clearly as possible. Friendlessness is rarely an indictment of character. It is more often a weave of rare psychological traits, misattuned environments, and unhealed wounds that taught you to hide the most essential parts of yourself. Extended isolation does have consequences, mental, emotional, and physical, not because solitude is shameful, but because the human nervous system was shaped by connection. The aim is not to glorify aloneness, nor to rush out of it, but to understand its impact with honesty. Jung pointed to something timeless. Loneliness emerges not from a lack of people, but from the inability to share one's interior truth. The path forward is not becoming more likable. It is becoming more aligned with the people who can actually meet you. If you imagine a lighthouse standing on a barren cliff, holding its beam through storm after storm, you might notice something subtle. The lighthouse is not reaching. It is not chasing. It is not begging the sea to change. It stands as itself until the ships that can navigate by its light finally come into view. The months ahead can serve as an initiation, not into performance or perfection, but into steadiness, into depth you no longer apologize for, into small, deliberate exposures of the real self that has waited patiently beneath the armor. There is a line at the end of some long nights that many men recognize only in hindsight. You were never broken, just early. Early to depth, early to discernment, early to sensitivity that others misread, early to the solitude that shaped you, early to the clarity that will one day draw the right people toward you, not through effort, but through resonance. If any part of this mirrored something in your own life, you might choose to offer one line below, a single signal from your experience. Not to explain yourself, but to remind another man watching this that he is not reading his story alone.